That's great. So we've heard a little bit from Dianne. I think we're going to hear a little bit more later about some of the potential pitfalls with some of the changes that we've seen. But there's also this other side, which is this notion of creative destruction. So there are industries, there are parts of our world that we've seen this play out multiple times, where an industry is disrupted by something new, and in the near term, it results in a bunch of losses of jobs. There's a sort of hysteria and panic, and everyone worries, like, what are we going to do? And then over the course of time, as it plays out, academics have shown that there's actually greater productivity, and it opens up new opportunities. And so before we focus on some of the negative things, I'm curious in some of the ways that we have seen the positive benefits of disruption. I mean, Henry, you invest in companies that by definition, most of them are trying to disrupt something. And so how do you reconcile that? I mean, where do you see some of these changes playing out in a very positive way?
I'm not an expert completely in the future work, but I do have opinions like so many other people do. And I get really excited about what this means for you all entering the workforce and then people in other countries, and being able to do work on your own terms and being able to be a cloud factory and being able to say, I want to do work between these college classes, or I want to do this other work outside. I think that there are millions of truck drivers that won't be driving trucks anymore. My heart breaks for the people that will not be able to get through that transition well, or for some of the people who very, very much enjoy that job. But I'm a glass half full person, so I tend to get excited about how many more people will be able to be that much closer to their families and be able to go to soccer games and be able to participate in work over the internet and to find some of the other things maybe in the service economy that work well. There is going to be some transition, and there are going to be some people who are going to go through a lot of hardship. You know, we all know the term the Luddites. The Luddites were those that fought the mechanization of the loom, and the mechanization of the loom ended up being a great thing. That many more people were able to get clothing, and yet there are some people that are put out of work. So my hope is that, like what Dianne had talked about, the writing's been on the wall for the truck drivers for some period of time. Most truck drivers have not lost their job, but the half is going to fall off the iceberg. And so it's a great opportunity for us getting out of the degree is probably not to enter into a career as a truck driver.
Yeah, don't do that.
That'd be bad. Yeah. But to think about, gosh, what might I do to be able to be a programmer and help the technology to get better? What are some of the other things that will happen? I think that many more people are going to find that much more time where they can have leisure. I think the service economy is going to boom. I think the opportunities that we're going to have to go on vacation and the whole tourist economy is going to get better as collectively the economy rises. And yet at the same time, people will fall through the cracks. And as creative destruction, while it be creative, will feel a lot more like destruction for others. And so you've got to be thinking, if faith is a part of your life, you've got to be thinking about, what does it look like for me to love my neighbor in the midst of this?
So in terms of that, I guess there's 2 points that I look from. One, I'm currently chairing a chemical company. We're making a biomaterial. It's called Tethys. And we're making a biomaterial out of cornstarch to replace the superabsorbents that go into diapers, which is, it's a business that hasn't changed much since the 80s. There's about 8-9 big chemical companies like BASF and Evonik who make 1 billion pounds of this material a year and have just been pushing it out the same way year after year. And we're coming in a way that's very disruptive to them. In a way, part of it is that they've grown to the point where there's no career advantage in inventing something new. You know, if you're a Dow and you can just sort of hold down your job until you retire and not risk the company or a lot of the company's money on something, then if nobody's expecting it from you, then you can write it out. And so the opportunity for a relatively small group with a small R&D budget to go and do something that these big companies can't do is just sitting out there. And there's just as we started down that path, the number of other billion-dollar opportunities that we see sitting out in front of us because we build a little competence in this space is just beyond what I would have expected. So I think there's always room for disruption, right? You kind of think, okay, people sort of settle into a pattern to do things. It's not just with electronics, but I think in terms of automation, as a believer, right, the most important thing are people. We know that because God went to the trouble of dying for us, right? I mean, He didn't you can go to the trouble of dying to create the internet or dying to save the whales or anything. It's people, right? And so being a student of people and being good at interacting with people, I think is always and is going to become more valuable. So one of the things that I looked at and I talk about in venues like this is that I discovered as an entrepreneur the first resource that I have access to before I had money or customers or employees or anything else. The first thing I could get access to is trust. And it works like there's kind of an economy of trust. If I can gather enough of it, I can trade it for investments or customers or employees or press exposure, strategic relations, or anything up and down the line. And if I'm looking at how a company is operating and I find a couple of people not getting along, usually there's some dysfunction of trust. They're not trusting each other as much as they should or they're supposed to. And so it's made me a student of trust, which is actually kind of convenient because within my Christian walk, what I'm trying to do is be more consistently the person that I'm aiming at being. And consistent people accumulate trust. If you figure out how to love people, the people that you trust the most are the ones that you know love you, right? I mean, there's a direct connection there. And so if you're able to make a habit of loving people, then that trust naturally accumulates. So there's a lot of things in terms of those. I talk about people skills, but it's not necessarily you're the person who throws parties. And I mean, I'm by nature an introvert, but I'm interested in people because my Lord is interested in people, right? And so He's sort of pulling me towards the extrovert side within that. So it's not just those kinds of PR people skills. It's in anything that you're doing. Those are the things that I think are going to last. I don't know how software is innately trustworthy in a certain way, but I don't know how it makes itself more trustworthy. I think that's I think those are really, really hard problems unless there's a paper you can cite. No, they're not.
Well, I think that's a good transition. So as we dig into this idea of personhood, some of the dangers and challenges, very macro things, and there's also micro things. We are always connected at all times. And I was thinking back to when I was a student here to date a little bit. I feel like it was yesterday, but I never sent a single text message when I was in college. I mean, it didn't exist. And that was only, 15, 16, 17 years ago, right? And it just, the nature and the pace at which stuff is changing, you already noted this, is incredible. And so I'm interested to dig into some of the macro changes, but then also personally how it affects our view of our own personhood and this blurring of the lines between technology and ourselves. And this is an area you've researched a great deal. So some things that we can look out for as we just live our lives.
Well, you mentioned social media, and it's something I do talk about, I have talked about with my students too, because this is creating this sort of artificial persona out on the internet through social media, the person who you wish you were rather than the person who you actually are. And I think students have discovered that it often puts them at great risk because they're putting all these things about themselves out there, which then come back to bite them when they're trying to get jobs and so forth. And I think there have been some very interesting studies recently showing that the people who are all connected socially through Facebook and social media actually are very lonely. That this is a very lonely generation, and that it's all artificial. It's this artificial persona, artificial friendships, and again, it's this blurring between the reality of human interaction and the reality of us as these sacred humans made in God's image versus these artificial humans that we're creating out there. And we're all interacting with each other's artificial parts as opposed to really interacting with the real, authentic people that we are created in God's image. So that comes out just in a social context. I guess from the work context, the 24/7 work mentality sometimes means that there is a blurring between then the family life and the work life. If you feel like you're totally always on call, having to answer the phone or the text, then that there's another blurring. That's another one of those continuities, blurring of a boundary between work, family, and so forth.
Maybe we should flesh that out too, because that's clearly a dominant macro trend. And so beyond just leaving the office at 6 and then dialing back in at 8:30. What are other ways that either of you, Chris or Henry, have have found that you've been able to be involved. You're both technology entrepreneurs, so you're embracing technology in one hand, and yet, what are the guardrails? Like, how do you deal with the personal implications of this? What are the challenges you face?
One of the things that we try to institute at Bandwidth and try to institute in our lives is just this concept of Sabbath. I mean, it's as old as the Bible, right? And one of the things that we really look for all of our portfolio companies is, are they leaving enough room for God to be evident in the workplace? Or are they trying to earn their own salvation? It's one of these other things. Do I work constantly? And why am I working so hard? And I actually had a really neat meeting with one of our portfolio companies 2 weeks ago who had been suffering from huge levels of anxiety. He'd also been working 90 hours a week. And he said, I had this major breakthrough. I said, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to lose my marriage. And he said, amazingly, as soon as I cut it back down to like 50 hours a week, all these great things started happening in the company. It was this beautiful thing. Because now he looks at it and he can see God at work. So he's not tempted to say, well, this is because I earned it, because it was my hard work. It was at a time where it was actually the lowest input. A practical thing that David's been able to institute at Bandwidth is this concept of a vacation embargo. When you go on vacation, you cannot email anybody about work, and nobody from work can email you. And it gives you this place to be able to have rest, because otherwise it's really, really, really hard.
Yeah, I think in some ways part of it, and well, actually, let me just, something that you said reminded me of, I work with high school students a lot, and one of the things that I think is, it's true about high school, maybe a little before and after, is that the two greatest fears are, one, that somebody will figure out who you really are, and the other is that nobody will figure out who you really are, right? And these two things are in tension, and the ability to create and curate this online persona just becomes this trap, right? Where what I really want is to be known, but I'm afraid enough of it that I'm going to curate something that I think people like, and ultimately, if people like that, I know they don't actually like me, right? And so it becomes this hole that you wind up getting into. But I think that it kind of gets to, in terms of that separation, it kind of gets a bit to idolatry, right? It's what is the important thing? What does the world revolve around, right? And if to some degree, some of us, and I think you and I are probably susceptible to this, we want the world to need us, right? We want to be someone that the world can't do without, right? And so you kind of reinforce that by checking your text and having people ask you to be places or answer calls or sort of fill yourself with those things. And it's good to do that good, but at a certain point it becomes a kind of form of idolatry, right? Where you're saying, okay, I want to set myself up in this place. I'm the indispensable person. And so I think that balance in life, sort of really coming to grips with who God is and who He isn't, is a part of that. I find that, I guess for me, when I was incredibly fortunate enough to have started and sold 3 companies when my kids were 2 and 4 years old. And so at that point, there really wasn't a point in doing another one, and thank goodness I didn't, because 2001 stunk for entrepreneurs. But
trust me,
yes, as Henry could tell you. So, but until my son was in his senior year of high school, I pretty much did the good that was in front of me. I help entrepreneurs get to where they're trying to go. I'd work on different nonprofit boards, but nothing that was going to keep me from missing a school play or a soccer game or smashing trucks on the living room floor with my son when the time presented itself. And that's, the thing is, it was a tremendous grace of God to create that opportunity, because, the second one, when I started it, I thought this could create a lot of opportunities, or I could look up and find that my son is 16 and I missed it. And I kind of trusted God with that, but after having gotten through it, I did set it aside. And so part of that is that I've worked in a very unstructured life where I'm kind of doing the good that's in front of me from one day to another. And to me, at least, it's been an antidote, right? It doesn't, nothing in particular revolves around me, but I get to do a lot of good around me. And I feel more like I'm partnering with God that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So I do want to present an opportunity. So if you have a question, something that you wanted to ask, we don't pretend like we have all the right questions. So we can't also promise to have the right answer. But if you have a question or something you'd like to touch on, raise your hand. We'll call on you right there in the back.
So just on this issue of putting boundaries on work and the problem of work creep sort of being I don't know, it sounds like you're talking about a novel thing. And it seems like part of that is a novel thing, but I mean, I grew up on a farm, and lots of people grow up on farms throughout the world. It's a fairly small percentage of Americans these days, but work is not something that had boundaries, right? I mean, if the cow was having trouble having a calf and it was dinner time, then right, that's not responding to your email, that's going to work. And so it seems like part of the novelty is work being taken out of the home and also being, or like out of the home place, and also being less immediately connected, right? So yes, what I'm doing at work is connected to home life, right? Because you have to make money to eat, but in the agrarian scenario, right, you're making the food to eat, or you're helping the cows to eat, right? And so there's this more immediate connection between home life and work life, and you can also bring your family alongside of you and learning that, right? So it seems like the novel thing is that the work is disconnected from the home in some sense. And so
or that it bifurcates your relationships. There are your work relationships, and there are your essentially non-work relationships, and those largely bifurcate. But you're right. I mean, there are, and that's I guess I'm less inclined to have a strict set of rules around things than to really have. Try to have an honest conversation about God with that. Am I balanced in terms of where I am? If I do this other thing, if I take on this other responsibility, is that what you want me to do, or am I doing that because I want to be needed? So there's those pieces, but but at the same time, I mean, I think that farming there's a natural rhythm to it, right? There's some seasons where there's a lot of work, and some seasons where there's less work. There's some parts of the day that are maybe work 6 days, 7 days a week, and other parts of the day where there's not. What's going on in work now is not only can you do work at any time of day, but as you work around the world, you're dealing with, if I'm dealing with somebody in India, I have to talk to them at 10 at night, or I have to talk to them at 6 in the morning to be able to have the conversation. And as you wind up working more globally, those rhythms get disrupted.
So I love the riff on this. I think, and maybe I'm unique in this, but maybe not. For the last 2.5 years, I haven't had an office. In almost 30 years of working, I haven't had an office. And as a result, I do a lot more of my work at home. And I do a lot more of my work when I'm in the car, picking my kids up at school. On one hand, that's a little bit of a challenge, because if I'm not making dedicated time where they think they're the most important thing, I've lost an opportunity. And yet, on the other hand, I actually celebrate some of that. I celebrate that because I have 3 boys, and it would be the case if I had girls, but I have 3 boys that are trying to understand, what does work look like? And why is Daddy doing work? And where does he find meaning in work? Where do I see him getting excited? And then the other thing that happens is, because work is so much more global now, I'll go on vacation in the summertime, and we'll go to Asia, and half of that will be family time, and half of that will be Daddy speaking at a conference, or Daddy having a work meeting or something like that. And so I think that I'd like to think, I actually like them up here on this panel and see if they think it's a good thing or not a good thing. But there's some aspect of being on the farm. When you're a kid and you grow up on the farm, you see, and you know what Daddy does. You understand whether you get joy in it or not, and whether you want to stay and have a career in farming or not. When our dads went to work for IBM, and they went and worked from 9 to 5, it's really hard for us to understand.
Yeah.
But now, because this gig economy, we're starting to be able to bring that in more.
Yeah, it was really confusing for my son. It's like, what do you do? It's like, I don't. Look, a squirrel. It's tough because it was clear there was a point where that was part of what led me to get back into being at companies. I felt like I actually kind of cheated my kids out of the opportunity to see me do what I was good at in work and kind of be in the middle of it. That I was trying to give them all the time I could, but they actually, I think, needed to see me doing some things that they could relate to.
Well, they saw you do the good that was in front of you.
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And it's all the key thing for all this is that you can't just be thinking about it on a panel today. You need to be thinking about each and every day. We have an opportunity to be more and more conscious about why we're doing what we're doing, and then how we're interacting with the people that are around us, and what kind of good are we doing.
Good. Right here.
Hi, I am reading a really good book by Tony Rink, who's a content producer for Desiring God, and it's called 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. And one of his main points is how to prioritize people through technology. And so I was wondering if you could just speak to, as successful Christians in the marketplace, times where you have utilized technology to prioritize people and times where you've had to put your phone down to prioritize people, and just speak to what that looks like, of when do you put your phone away to eat dinner with your family, or when do you pick it up?
That's good.
Dan, you want to talk
Sure.
about
Well, I mean, I just came off of being vice provost of the faculty at GW for 5 years, and so I definitely learned how to prioritize people. If the president from down the hall called me, I went down to his office, and that was a priority. Anyway, I think that that's a great point. You can definitely use technology, and I have done that for years. I remember the moment I had this sort of epiphany that if the phone rang, you didn't actually have to answer it. You know, that you really could make a decision not to answer the phone at a particular time. And so one of the things about technology is you can look at the email, you can prioritize who you're going to respond to, set up a to-do list or a schedule. You can look at your text messages. So the technology does give you a window into all the various people who are trying to contact you, and you can use that technology to actually prioritize how you're going to communicate with them, and so that's true. Now, you have to do that. You have to, again, be careful. I was joking about if the president called down the hall, of course you went, but you do have to be very conscious that you don't want to ignore certain people because they're not as important as other people. And that was something I was always very aware of when I was at the university, making sure that I made the time for students or made time for people who I personally considered important, although they might not have been considered important on the pecking order from the environment that I was in.
That's great. It's funny. So my daughter's living in LA now, and a lot more of my interactions with her is text while she's out there, because that's just the media that she and her friends, how they interact with. And so I've kind of had to learn, how do I, what's my voice with text? And there's times where, because she's a few hours out, it winds up being at 10 or 11 o'clock at night. I have to be prepared to be in the middle of a conversation. I think tactically, something that technology has done a lot for me is it means a lot to somebody if they've lost somebody close to them, their mom or their husband or their wife or a kid. It can be very isolating because the world picks, everyone gets together around them, they have a service, whatever, and then a week later the world gets back to its regular speed, except for them. And the world slows down. It stays slowing down. The more obvious it is that everyone else has moved on, the more lonely it is. And I just have a note, when somebody loses someone, it goes to my calendar, so I can send them a text or an email just saying, I know it's a hard day for you. Just so they know that they're not alone in it, that there's somebody else there, right? And it's a simple little thing to be able to do. But there's just a number of people that I feel like I've been, just able to be just a little spot that they needed that morning. And so just, it's a little tactical thing, but I would say in terms of prioritizing people, I don't know that outside of technology that would be happening. So.
One more question. One thought I had was there's an opportunity to be countercultural too. So, there's never been a more powerful time to write a handwritten note.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's just there's opportunity always. When there's changes, there's always opportunity. And often it's countercultural. It's countercultural to think that faith should drive the way you work. But it's probably the most powerful way to work.